Keanu Reeves stood quietly in the first-class line, dressed simply, a stark contrast to the luxury around him. A man behind him watched with barely concealed disdain, his suit crisp, his expression sharp, the kind that was used to power, money, and control. He scanned Keanu from head to toe, faded jeans, scuffed boots, and a backpack that had clearly seen a few too many journeys. Seriously? The man muttered under his breath. This guy, in first class? What happened next would leave everyone on that flight stunned and change one man's view of the world forever. But before we continue, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from today? If you enjoy powerful stories like this, stories that restore your faith in humanity, make sure to subscribe to this channel. We've got more coming every day, and tomorrow's story will touch your heart in ways you don't expect. LAX, Los Angeles International Airport. A constant hum of rolling luggage, distant boarding announcements, and conversations that melted into white noise filled the terminal. In the middle of the chaos stood Keanu Reeves, motionless, calm. There was nothing flashy about him, no designer shades, no assistant whispering in his ear. Just a man with quiet eyes, worn clothes, and a stillness that didn't belong to this hectic world. He carried a weathered backpack and clutched a paperback book, its spine bent, its cover faded. To many, he looked like a traveler on a budget. To one man, he looked like someone who didn't belong. Martin Aldridge, 45, was a real estate magnate who didn't believe in coincidences. He believed in brands, in image, in status. His luggage alone cost more than some people's rent. He was used to getting what he paid for, and in first class, he paid for exclusivity. As Martin walked into the first-class cabin of the plane, he froze when he saw Keanu already seated in 2B by the window, dressed like a hiker, not a high flyer. Martin rolled his eyes and moved into 2A beside him, tossing his leather briefcase into the overhead bin. He purposely shoved Keanu's canvas bag to the side with more force than necessary. A book slipped out of Keanu's open bag, The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho. Figures, Martin muttered under his breath. Keanu picked it up quickly and smiled. Sorry about that. Martin didn't respond. As the plane took off, champagne was served. Martin accepted a glass without looking up, savoring it like a wine critic. Keanu politely declined. Just water, please, he said softly. Martin raised a brow. Who turns down Dom Perignon in first class? The two men sat in silence for a while. Martin glanced sideways a few times, watching Keanu read quietly, legs tucked slightly, posture relaxed. No phone out, no laptop open. Just reading, still, present, unbothered. It annoyed Martin more than he cared to admit. Dinner arrived. Martin chose filet mignon, grilled asparagus, and a deep red Cabernet. Keanu went with a quinoa salad and water. Martin struck up a loud, performative conversation with the attendant. This steak's a little overdone, and the wine pairing, not nearly as balanced as the 2016 Bordeaux I had last week on Qatar. But I suppose we can't expect all airlines to meet global standards. The attendant nodded politely, offering to bring a new plate. Martin declined. He'd made his point. Keanu said nothing. Then, turbulence. A few sharp bumps rattled the cabin. Martin's wine glass wobbled, tipping just enough to splash onto his pristine white shirt. Damn it, he snapped, reaching for a napkin. Before the flight attendant could respond, Keanu gently offered his cloth napkin across the seat. Here, take mine, he said, soft-spoken. Martin turned to him slowly. The man was offering him help? In that hoodie? No thanks, Martin replied coldly. I don't need help. Keanu nodded and pulled the napkin back. He didn't respond. He just returned to his book. But to Martin, that silence said everything. After a few tense minutes, Martin leaned over again. His voice was low, his words sharp. Let me give you a tip, he hissed. People like you, with your backpack and your thrift store outfit, don't belong in first class. You're lucky they even let you in here. Keanu looked up. For a moment, the cabin went quiet in Martin's ears. He saw the flicker in Keanu's eyes. Not anger, not shame, just something that made Martin feel smaller than he ever had. Keanu paused, and then said quietly, I understand. He didn't argue, didn't lash out. He just nodded and returned to his book. Martin sat back in his seat, strangely unsettled. The man hadn't defended himself, hadn't even seemed insulted. That made it worse. That made him feel worse. He poured another half glass of wine, trying to wash down the guilt that had just begun to form. Little did he know, within the next hour, he would be watching this same man, the one he'd just belittled, perform an act of selflessness that would shake Martin to his core and leave him changed forever. The air in first class grew colder, though the temperature hadn't changed. Martin sat back, sipping the last of his wine, satisfied that he had made his point. The man beside him no longer read. Instead, he stared quietly out the window, the vast horizon reflecting in his eyes. In the faint cabin light, Martin caught the side of his face. There was no anger, no indignation, just silence. A kind of worn-out calm that came not from weakness, but from someone too used to being misunderstood. Martin's phone buzzed with a new email. He welcomed the distraction and opened it. An update on a new property bid in Santa Monica. Profits, contracts, numbers, safe territory. He tapped a quick reply, tossing a glance at his neighbor now and then. The man remained perfectly still. About 40 minutes later, just as the attendants dimmed the cabin lights for rest, an urgent voice came crackling through the curtain from Coach. "Excuse me, somebody help," but she fainted. Gasps followed. A call light blinked furiously. The curtain swished open. A flight attendant hurried through with a first aid kit, calling aloud, "Is there a medical professional on board? Please. We have a pregnant woman who's passed out." Martin sat up straighter but didn't move. The man in 2B, however, was already unbuckling his seatbelt. "Is she okay?" he asked, rising to his feet. The flight attendant hesitated. "We need space. We want to move her somewhere to lie down." Without pause, the man said, "She can have my seat." The attendant blinked. "Sir, this is first class. You paid—" "Doesn't matter," he interrupted, already reaching for his duffel bag. "Let her lie here. It's more comfortable." Martin turned his head in disbelief. The man was giving up his premium seat, his $6,000 seat, for someone from the economy cabin? A stranger? "Unbelievable," Martin muttered under his breath. Within moments, two attendants helped the pale, trembling woman into the first-class seat. She looked barely 20, her belly large beneath a loose cardigan. Her husband followed, holding her hand, eyes wide with worry. "Thank you," he whispered to the man in the hoodie. "I don't know what we'd—" "You don't need to say anything," the man replied gently. "She just needs rest." He removed his hoodie and rolled it into a makeshift pillow, gently slipping it behind her lower back. She closed her eyes with a sigh of relief. And then, without fanfare, he turned and walked back into economy, duffel over his shoulder, quietly disappearing behind the curtain. The entire first-class cabin sat in stunned silence. Martin didn't know what to do. He felt as though the very oxygen had changed. Suddenly his expensive suit, his wine glass, his arrogant words all felt cheap. The man he had dismissed, had insulted, just gave away his comfort to help someone he didn't know. No cameras, no audience, just kindness. Quiet, effortless kindness. A soft voice broke the silence. "He looks familiar," a woman a few rows back whispered. Another replied, "Yeah, I swear I've seen him in a movie or something." Martin's ears perked up. His heart thudded. Slowly, painfully, the puzzle pieces began to fit. The face, the voice, the way he never snapped back. He turned to the flight attendant. "The man who gave up his seat. What's his name?" The attendant smiled gently. "That was Keanu Reeves." The words hit Martin like a brick. Keanu freaking Reeves. Martin froze. The cabin seemed to tilt for a moment as the name echoed in his ears. Keanu Reeves? He didn't know what hit him first. The shame, the embarrassment, or the sheer disbelief. He had just insulted Keanu Reeves, one of the most beloved actors in the world. A man known not only for his roles in The Matrix, John Wick, and Speed, but for his humility, generosity, and kindness. Martin's mind spun like a roulette wheel of regret. He remembered the quiet way Keanu had accepted the napkin rejection. The way he had said, "I understand," after being insulted. The way he had given up his seat without hesitation, as if comfort and status meant absolutely nothing. And Martin had called him a nobody. He leaned back in his chair, now feeling as if it didn't belong to him. All the status and prestige he'd been clinging to had just crumbled in an instant. The irony was unbearable. He had accused a man who belonged in the world's hearts of not belonging in first class. He peeked through the curtain toward economy. Somewhere behind it, the man he'd treated like dirt was now sitting in a narrow, upright seat beside a crying baby, or a loud teenager, while a young mother rested peacefully in the comfort he'd surrendered. The thought twisted in Martin's chest. He clenched the armrest, fighting an urge he rarely felt, the urge to apologize. But would Keanu even want to hear it? No. He was probably used to this kind of treatment, Martin thought bitterly. Used to being ignored until someone recognized him. And yet, despite all that, he never made anyone feel small, not even someone who deserved it. Especially not someone like Martin. The rest of the flight dragged on painfully for Martin. He couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't stop thinking about how badly he had misjudged someone. Not just any someone, but a global icon of decency. At one point, he pulled out his phone and searched, Keanu Reeves, good deeds. The results poured in. Donated millions to cancer research, secretly funded crew members' children's education, took pay cuts so production teams wouldn't get laid off, rode the subway for years, gave up his seat every time. Martin's throat tightened. This wasn't just some actor who played a hero. This man was one. And Martin? He had been the villain in the very first scene. As the cabin lights brightened for landing, Martin made up his mind. He would apologize. Not because Keanu was famous, but because Keanu had shown the kind of character that deserved an apology. It wasn't just about righting a wrong. It was about learning how wrong he had been his whole life. The announcement came on. Cabin crew, prepare for landing. Martin unbuckled his belt the moment the wheels touched down. The flight attendant gave him a look, but he offered a quick nod and pushed through the curtain toward coach. People turned as he moved down the aisle. Some recognized him from first class, the polished man with the expensive watch and ego to match, now walking slowly, head slightly bowed. Row 24. There he was. Keanu sat in the middle seat between a college-aged girl and an older man reading a newspaper. The girl whispered excitedly as she glanced sideways at him. Keanu smiled kindly, hands resting on his lap. His hoodie was folded neatly across his knees, his worn duffel underfoot. Martin swallowed. "Excuse me," he said softly. Keanu turned, and his expression shifted slightly in recognition. "Hi," he said warmly. No bitterness, just kindness. Again. Martin knelt slightly in the narrow aisle, eyes searching for the words. I came to say I'm sorry." Keanu tilted his head. "For what?" Martin exhaled slowly. "For judging you. For the way I spoke to you earlier. I thought you didn't belong in first class. I treated you like garbage. And then I watched you give up your seat, your comfort, for someone else. And I realized I've been sitting in the wrong seat my whole life." Silence. Passengers nearby stopped to listen. The older man lowered his newspaper. The girl gasped quietly. Keanu looked at Martin for a long moment. Then he offered a small nod. "Thank you," he said gently. "I appreciate you coming back here." Martin blinked, surprised by the grace in that reply. "You're not angry?" Keanu shook his head. People have bad days, or bad habits. What matters is whether we let those moments define us, or we grow from them. Martin stood frozen, overwhelmed not by words, but by Keanu's lack of judgment. There was no scolding, no dramatic, "I told you so," no hint of condescension, only a quiet presence, one that made Martin feel seen, maybe for the first time in years. Not for the suit, not for the wealth, not even for the guilt, but for who he really was underneath all of it. He struggled to speak again. "I think I've lived my life thinking status meant everything, that how people dressed, where they sat, what they owned, those things told you who they were." His voice wavered. "But you just reminded me that real worth is what someone gives, not what they wear." Keanu gave a small, thoughtful smile. "We all forget sometimes," he said. "But the good news is, we can remember again." Those words hit Martin harder than any lecture could. Behind him, a few passengers listened quietly. The older man in the aisle seat offered Martin a nod of respect. The college girl gave a gentle smile, clearly moved by the scene. Martin continued, quieter now. "What you did for that woman, it was beautiful, and it shamed me. Not because you're famous, but because you did what I should have done, what I didn't even think to do." Keanu shrugged softly. "It wasn't a big deal." "That's exactly why it is," Martin replied, his eyes glistening. "Because for you, kindness is casual. For the rest of us, it's a headline." The older man next to Keanu chuckled under his breath. "That's good. You should write that down." Martin smiled for the first time. A real smile. It was strange how light his chest felt now, even in this cramped aisle, surrounded by strangers. humility had peeled something off him, a burden he hadn't even known he was carrying. As the line of passengers began moving forward for deplaning, Martin stood up and prepared to return to the front cabin. But before he turned, he looked back at Keanu one last time. "Thank you," he said. "Not just for forgiving me, but for reminding me that being good doesn't need an audience. It just needs a heart." Keanu gave a respectful nod. "Safe travels, man." Martin nodded and walked slowly back to first class, but nothing about it felt the same. The wide leather seat now felt undeserved. The champagne, hollow. The space, excessive. He sat down and glanced to his right, where Keanu had once been. Now, in that same spot, the young mother slept peacefully, her face calm and color returning to her cheeks. Her husband, seated across the aisle, gave Martin a smile of gratitude. Martin smiled back, though part of him felt he didn't deserve even that. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Martin reached into his briefcase and pulled out a notebook he rarely used, one given to him by a mentor years ago. Inside, its first page was still blank. He turned to it, pen trembling slightly in his hand, and he wrote, "Status means nothing if your character is bankrupt. Be the person who gives up the seat, not the one who guards it with pride. Kindness is the only currency that never loses value." He paused and underlined the last sentence. The jet bridge extended and the doors hissed open. First-class passengers stood, grabbing their designer bags and briefcases, ready to disembark into the bustling terminal of LAX. Martin waited. He watched the young mother carefully rise with the help of a flight attendant, her husband holding her hand. They nodded politely as they passed him, unaware of the emotional weight that hung between seat 2A and 2B. Martin offered a soft, unspoken bow of respect. It was the only thing he could give. The seat she now left had once belonged to a man far more deserving than himself. As he stepped off the plane, the noise of the airport swallowed him, but his thoughts stayed quiet. He paused at the edge of the gate, peering through the crowd, searching. There, moving calmly through the terminal, blending in with everyday travelers, was Keanu Reeves. Still in his hoodie, still carrying his duffel bag. No entourage, no flashes of cameras, no shouting fans. Just a man who had somehow become more than human in Martin's eyes. Martin hesitated. Should he approach again? But before he could decide, something happened. A janitor pushing a cart of trash bags accidentally bumped into a businessman in a navy suit. The man cursed under his breath, clearly annoyed. The janitor bowed his head in apology, flustered. Keanu, walking by at that exact moment, stopped. He reached into his bag, pulled out a folded $20 bill, and quietly handed it to the janitor. "Grab yourself a hot meal," he said with a gentle smile. The janitor looked up, confused. "Sir, you don't have to." "It's okay," Keanu replied. "Thank you for what you do. This place wouldn't run without you." And then he disappeared into the terminal, as casually as if nothing had happened. Martin stood still, watching the scene like a final chapter in a novel he hadn't realized he was reading. He realized then that Keanu wasn't just a good man. He was consistently good, even when no one was looking. Especially when no one was looking. Martin reached into his blazer and took out the notebook again. He flipped to the page he'd written on earlier, added one final line beneath it. "Heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear old hoodies and sit in 24B. 3 weeks later." Martin sat at his office desk, now strangely tidy. The photos of luxury cars had been replaced by framed quotes about humility and kindness. His assistant knocked gently and peeked in. "Sir, there's someone here asking for a meeting. From the Veterans Housing Project?" Martin nodded. "Send them in." The man who entered wore a modest jacket and carried a folder. They spoke for 20 minutes. By the end of the meeting, Martin stood and extended his hand. "I'd like to fund your next shelter," he said. "Quietly, anonymously." The man looked stunned. "Are you sure? That's a large commitment." Martin smiled. "Let's just say, someone gave up his seat so I could see the world differently." Final narration, voiceover style. Sometimes it takes just one moment to change a man's entire life. One look, one action, one person willing to show kindness without expecting anything in return. In a world obsessed with power, image, and status, there are still souls who carry light quietly. And if we're lucky enough to cross paths with them, we're never the same again. Then he closed the notebook and looked out the window as the plane rolled to a stop at the gate.